Give the people what they want.
Give the people what they want.
Give the people what they want. Your weekly movement news roundup.
It's Give the People What They Want, brought to you from People's Dispatch. That's Zoe and Prashant. I'm Vijay from Globetrotter. It's the 24th of February. This is the 116th show. This is an important date because it's the anniversary of the, what does one even call it? The special operation is what the Russian call their entry into Ukraine. The Europeans and the US and the Ukrainian government call it a war. In Bangalore, India, the G20 is meeting where the Indian draft on the G20 communique, the final communique, calls it a crisis. The French and the Germans have said they won't sign that G20 communique until it calls it a war. We can't even talk about what's happening in Ukraine because the language is part of the conflict itself. Is it a war? Is it a special military operation? Is it a conflict? Even that is in doubt, not only amongst the combatants, that is to say, the Ukrainians and the Russians, but also amongst the leading countries in the world, the G20, as they meet in Bangalore. The conflict is a war because there are, after all, people shooting at each other. I think that's pretty much the definition, but I understand very well why there is a debate and dispute about how to characterize what is going on. It is also a debate and dispute about who the combatants are. Is this a war between Russia and Ukraine? Is it a war, a conflict between the United States, NATO, and Russia? Is it a broader conflict, or is it a narrow conflict about Donbass and the Crimea and Mariupol and cities whose names we have come to know only because the tanks go back and forth across the battle lines? It's hard to say exactly what is happening within Ukraine. Looks like there's been a kind of stalemate over the last several months, ever since the Christmas ceasefire. The battle lines haven't moved decisively. There is an expectation that in the spring, Russia will put more of its tank corps into the battle. Already, the Russians are using greater air power. Now there is a call not only for the tanks that have been released to Ukraine, but also for fighter jets from, say, the United Kingdom and so on to come into the battle. Again, very difficult to know what's exactly happening in Ukraine. Winter is a difficult time to fight in that part of the world. People are anticipating some kind of spring offensive. We'll see what happens. Meanwhile, talk of negotiation has been set aside. At the United Nations, there was a vote in the General Assembly, the bulk of the global South once more refusing to join up behind either of the sides. In other words, a very large number of abstentions at the UN General Assembly vote, not necessarily people voting for or against that war. It's an interesting development to see countries like India, which had been quite firmly behind the United States in many of the world affairs, often lining up, even when there was a non-right-wing government. India lined up with the United States in the early 2000s in the campaign against Iran. Now, India refusing to line up. Very interesting development. Mexico, Indonesia, countries like that, highly, large populations, influential in their regions, not willing to line up behind the United States at the UN General Assembly. At Munich, there was a lot of talk about the war needing to be ended. Vice President of Colombia, Francia Marquez, made a strong statement saying that there's got to be consideration about the climate issue, not just the issue of war in Ukraine. What about the rest of us and the rest of the world? Strongest statement came from Sarah Kungelwa Amadia, the Namibian Prime Minister, who said that too much money is being spent on this war, money that needs to be spent on development. Very powerful statements made by Global South leaders at Munich, so much so that Emmanuel Macron, who is right now refusing to sign the G20 communique, Emmanuel Macron in Munich said that the West has lost its credibility with the Global South. Very strong statement coming from Macron, realization that cleavages have opened up. At the end of our show, we're going to talk a little bit about the Chinese plan that has been released today, a 12-point plan. We're going to come back to that at the end of the show. Let's switch gears now, not to forget another conflict, another war that's ongoing in a way, despite a military withdrawal. Prashant, take us to Afghanistan, a country in deep distress, and its funds now being decided upon not in Afghanistan but elsewhere.
All right, Vijay. I mean, this is of course about the money that belongs to the Afghanistan bank, which has been going through it's a bit of an absurd case in the sense that there are $7 billion that belong to the Afghanistan bank, which the United States somehow automatically is claimed or seized by virtue of it being some kind of global guardian of finances and global guardian of peace and security immediately after the Taliban took over. Now, it's important to remember that this $7 billion is the money of the Afghan people. And for the longest time, the fate of this money was in a limbo at a time when Afghanistan really badly needed it. We know that after the Taliban took over in August 2021, the West, of course, as planned, they withdrew. It was complete chaos, and it was not only military withdrawal, like you pointed out, but the immediate withdrawal of all infrastructure related to development, to any kind of economic work, and all of that just collapsed in one single blow. And the country endured a huge economic crisis, continues to endure today. And this $7 billion was vital at that point of time, and all this point of time, it was frozen for many, many months after that. And then what happened was that the Joe Biden administration made this extremely strange decision where it said that half of that money could potentially go to pay victims of the 9/11 attack on the World Trade Center, the Twin Towers. And this was a decision that really surprised a lot of people, because people were like, what do the people of Afghanistan whose money it is? Why should this money, what rights can the Joe Biden administration presume take 50%, that's still close to $3.5 billion, and assign it to this case? So the recent development is that a US district judge has now ruled that the US government cannot seize this $3.5 billion. But of course, the grounds it is said so are still quite problematic, so to speak, because the grounds are not that it has said that the money belongs to the people of Afghanistan, but it has also said that it is because it cannot acknowledge the Taliban as the government of Afghanistan that it cannot assign this $3.5 billion to the 9/11 victims. So it's, in the sense that this case is, of course, not over, but I think the fact that there's a district judge in the United States is issuing a convoluted order which talks about the legality of the money of the Afghan people and what rights the US has on it really says a lot about the global world order today. And like I said, this is at a time when the crisis in Afghanistan is pretty bad. We had a report on it a couple of months ago in January, where winter was at its peak. At that point, I think about 90% of the Afghan population was living in poverty. 4 out of 5 households witnessing a significant decrease in their outcome, and I think 28 million of the 40 million odd people basically were depending on humanitarian aid at that point of time. And this was say nearly 1.5 years after the Taliban took over. It's not even the immediate aftermath of the war or something. So it's not that we saw that after the Taliban withdrawal, after the US withdrawal, after the Taliban took over, there was a complete collapse in terms of structures which actually enabled aid to come in. There was a huge shortage of currency. There was a huge shortage of basic food supplies. There was no money to pay salaries. The Taliban, of course, making many of these issues much, much worse through its very extremely regressive social policies, making matters much more miserable for large sections of the population, especially women. But fundamentally, in this economic crisis was one that was caused by decades following the invasion, the fact that the Afghanistan's economy was basically left as an economy completely dependent on foreign aid, and that is what continues to haunt the people of Afghanistan today. And in this context, the fact that these billions of dollars are still completely, the people are cut off from this is really, there's no other way to describe it but a crime. And the fact that the international finances, the legal system are so organized really makes it. And we have seen examples like this before. I think Iran has also faced a similar situation with regards to some of its assets. But the fact that news like this, needs far more coverage, and I think far more questions about who gets the right to actually decide on some of these issues? We've seen similar and even sometimes even more staggering examples like the case of Venezuela's gold, which again rightfully belongs to the people. The U.S. government basically endorsing a coup, helping plotters sort of take over, capture this kind of money. So all said and done, I think a very good example of the kind of complete lawlessness that prevails in the name of protecting democracy.
Yeah, it's a very important story, and I know that we've been on it from the beginning. Quick thing to mention: 21 state attorney generals in the United States want to now designate Mexican drug cartels as terrorist organizations. Looks like from the US, Zoe, everybody's a terrorist outside the country. I mean, I'm not going to defend drug cartels, but the government in Afghanistan, the drug cartels, everybody seems to carry that designation. This comes at a time of an important case in New York having to do with drugs, Mexico, and the United States. Tell us what happened recently in a New York courtroom.
Well, I think it's interesting you mentioned that because people are not when they're working with the US government, they're not terrorists. As soon as it becomes more convenient for them to kind of acknowledge their criminality, that's when they can be called terrorists. And I think this is a very clear case with this ruling that actually happened in New York City, but has tremendous impacts on politics in Mexico. Genaro Garcia Luna was found guilty in a US federal court of a slew of drug trafficking charges, accepting bribes from drug cartels. And important to notice, he was the security chief under two Mexican presidents, Vicente Fox and Felipe Calderon. And it's really astounding because he was in charge of leading the war on drugs, but he was accepting bribes from major cartel leaders such as El Chapo, and essentially allowing safe passage for them into the United States and throughout Mexico. And this is really crucial because for the past several decades, Mexico has been engaged in this war on drugs, and hundreds of thousands of people have been impacted, disappeared, assassinated, killed, all in the name of this war on drugs. I mean, it's one of the worst humanitarian travesties right now. And of course, this also has to influence the swell of migrants that have been forced to flee their homes in Mexico. And really, this ruling shows that not only is the narrative around the war on drugs completely skewed, but that the government under Vicente Fox, under Felipe Calderon, and surely under Peña Nieto as well, were in cahoots with the drug lords. So, they're benefiting from this war on drugs. They're benefiting from all of the drug trafficking that's going on across their national territory. But who suffers from this? It's the people of Mexico who are seeing their lives terrorized, who are being lied to. And at the same time, these are the politicians that are the closest allies of the US who are getting funds to, of course, fuel this war on drugs. And it's really astounding. And in response to this verdict, there has been a very, very large response, of course, by the government right now of Andrés Manuel López Obrador, who for long has really accused these former presidents of collusion with drug traffickers. And him and many other people have called for further investigations. Felipe Calderon, right after the verdict was released, he published on Twitter that he never had any idea of these crimes that were being committed by his chief of security. He had no involvement, never benefited from drug trafficking. But I think that's many people have questioned this. It's been widely rejected. And activists are demanding that these presidents actually be investigated, be put on trial. There was already an attempt by Andrés Manuel López Obrador and the Morena Party to actually bring these presidents to justice. They had a consultation, which was sort of thwarted by the electoral agency. But there is serious motivations by victims of this drug war, by the victims of the hundreds and thousands of people who have been disappeared, to really actually take forward this looking for justice. Because what this conviction shows is that there was direct collaboration between Mexican officials and drug cartels, And really, this has to be investigated more. Andres Manuel has called for the Genaro Garcia Luna to actually testify about the involvement of his bosses, of these presidents. So it's definitely something we're going to be continuing to watch. And I encourage people to follow Alina Duarte and Sin Censura to really get the scoop on this as it develops.
It's an important story. Lots of money involved, hundreds of millions of dollars of bribes from the Sinaloa cartel. Very interesting development to see. But, it's a classic case of United States government going after people after they've become irrelevant to a particular story. They're not going after the linchpin guy now. They're going after somebody who has had a history of being in that role. One should not be, I suppose, too deluded by that. Give the people what they want. That's the kind of news you get from us. Zoe and Prashant from People's Dispatch. I'm Vijay from Globetrotter. Always on the beat looking to see what's happening in Palestine. People's Dispatch has a story about the situation in Nablus. Prashant, every single day seems to be more and more stories of this kind. Take us to Palestine. Tell us what's happening.
Right, Vijay. Of course, the tragedy, another 10 people killed in Nablus over the past couple of days. And I think the numbers are pretty illustrative. I think 60 people at least have been killed in the occupied territories this year. And we're not actually, crossed 60 days of the calendar yet. So that's really, I think that really shows the extent of the kind of murderous spree Israel has been on this year. And it's not just this year. We know that 2022 was probably the worst year on record in terms of the deaths of Palestinians and the number of the kind of attacks, the kind of raids that are taking place on a daily basis. Nablus is one city, Jenin is another, Ramallah is another city. Again, many of these cities constantly being targeted. The smallest sign of resistance by Palestinians, then being used as a pretext by Israelis to sort of unleash a kind of military force that you would only see in a proper warfare. You have helicopters, you have artillery, you have soldiers armed with very sophisticated equipment coming and firing on what are essentially civilians who are refusing to sort of basically let occupation forces take over their entire locality. And I think among those killed this year, I believe at least 13 are children as well, which again goes to show again nothing surprising as far as the Israeli record is concerned. And this, I think, is the second, big massacre, second or third big massacre we've seen this year. But again, equally important, I think, to also look at some of the global developments around Palestine. So earlier this week, I believe on Monday, we had the United Nations the Security Council dealing with the question of settlements. And this was an interesting discussion because there was a resolution condemning the expansion of settlements after Israel recognized some illegal checkpoints. And the United States intervened very forcefully with both the Palestinians and the Israelis, tried their best to sort of prevent this resolution because their claim was that if the resolution were to go to the UN Security Council, they would have to veto it. So although they disapproved apparently of the Israeli settlement expansion program, if the resolution did come through condemning these settlements, the US would have to veto it. And by basically holding this diplomatic gun to the head of the Palestinians, they converted what was a Security Council resolution into a Security Council presidential statement, which has no binding effect. So what finally came out of the UN Security Council was a presidential statement condemning settlement activities. Now, the important thing to note here is that the United States claimed this as a diplomatic victory, saying that from both sides it extracted what was called a 6-month freeze on all kinds of activities. Now, this technically meant that This technically meant that the Israelis would not, announce anything about settlements or build any new settlements, do any settlement work for 6 months. But just 2 days later or 3 days later, on Thursday, the news came that the Israeli government had approved 7,000 new housing units in the occupied territories. So much so for the 6-month freeze. And the same media organizations which reported the diplomatic victory or whatever you call it of the US in extracting this 6-month freeze also reported that it's unclear what this means, since the Israelis had supposedly committed to that, and 2 days later or 3 days later had announced the approval of these 7,000 new homes. And I think this really kind of goes to show The sort of power that the Israeli establishment right now has over its much more stronger ally. We sort of often term it as a patron-client relationship or whatever, but really the question here is, who is the bigger power at this point? Because it's clear that Israel is able to sort of push the United States in any direction it wants, and the US establishment, due to either internal political constraints, ideological beliefs, whatever, is completely beholden to the Israeli establishment to the extent that it is willing to look like a complete, without any credibility at all for this purpose. But in the midst of all this, what happens is incidents like Nablus. What happens is the incidents of young people being shot dead, of minors being shot dead, of women being shot dead, of thousands of lives being destroyed because of Israeli occupation.
And then the neurological impact this has on Palestine in general. I mean, 10 may be killed, but millions of Palestinians feel that the bullet was meant for them. A terrible situation. Palestine, United States, these are words that we hold together because they are held together by the Israeli occupation. But we're going to switch to another story, which also has the words Palestine and the United States, in this case, East Palestine, Ohio. Zoe, some terrible things happening in the United States regarding trains and environmental destruction. What happened in the ill-named East Palestine, Ohio?
Well, on February 3rd, a train derailed in East Palestine, Ohio. 50 cars of this train derailed from the tracks, and many of them carried hazardous materials. And their fire broke out, and the officials were feared that this could cause a huge explosion because of the amount of hazardous chemicals that they were transporting. And they essentially conducted a controlled release of these substances. Some of them are extremely toxic substances. One of them used in World War I as a chemical weapon. And since then, there has been a series of events. Authorities in the region didn't really explain what was happening. Residents seeing what was happening, getting very concerned, and of course the environmental impacts, the health impacts following this have been very quick. There has been mass death of local animals, of fish, of livestock, and other animals that people have in their area. There have been health impacts on the residents. And as residents raise more and more concerns to authorities, to news sources, more and more authorities within Ohio and on a national level essentially were denying all of this happening, saying the water is clean. We have registered no impact on the local wildlife. We don't really know what we're talking about. More and more people's anger began to grow. Now we're standing at 20 days since this horrific environmental disaster took place. And people's anger is only continuing to grow because the Biden administration has essentially provided no clear information, no clear solution. The EPA has essentially tried to cover up many aspects of this. Many environmental experts and scientists have said that the impacts of all of these toxic chemicals being released into the environment, into the water, into the air, is not only going to impact people's lives now, but this could have impacts 10, 20 years down the road. And there's also a lot of complicity of the railroad company Norfolk Southern, who has been active in taking away environmental regulations, taking away work safety regulations. As we know, last year, railroad workers across the US were on the verge of a massive strike, and Joe Biden intervened and stopped the strike from happening. So people are rightfully outraged because it is these same safety regulations that actually could have stopped such a horrific accident. This isn't the first accident for this railroad company. And in the context of all of this confusion, of trying to deny what's happening, of covering up, actually Donald Trump, who is not active on Twitter, but is active politically, went to East Palestine, spoke to the people. And important to point out that right at this moment, Joe Biden decided it was more important to go to Ukraine and continue to warmonger and promise more weapons than actually to go to this site of environmental catastrophe. And the right wing has really capitalized on this moment. Now Secretary of Transportation Pete Buttigieg has gone and made many statements, but I think people are rightfully upset with both parties. Donald Trump for actually paving the way for a lot of these environmental regulations to be removed and lifted. Joe Biden for giving such a lukewarm response. People are in serious danger. Their lives, the lives of their families, the environment are extremely threatened by what's happened, and they're not getting clear information. They're not getting clear solutions. So it's an ongoing tragedy. Norfolk Southern walked out of a town hall meeting that they were supposed to attend to answer questions of the community. Just extreme disregard, negligence for people's lives. And this is definitely not the end of it. And there's actually been there's continued to be environmental disasters since the train derailment. So I think it's extremely important. These environmental regulations have put people's lives in, taking them away has really put people's lives in jeopardy. And we're seeing the impacts of this.
Well, as you said, Biden left the United States, didn't really go and lead in places like Ohio and other places where there have been these spills, went to Munich. At Munich, there was an interesting encounter between Wang Yi, the leading diplomat from China, and Mr. Blinken. Mr. Wang Yi said, listen, what are you doing about all this stuff regarding the balloons? These are $12 balloons that were launched by some hobby society in the Midwest. You shot them down with $500,000 of military equipment. Don't use this balloon to escalate tensions with China. China is not interested in the escalation of tensions. Very interesting development in Munich. Pretty strong words from Wang Yi. Wang Yi met in Munich with a range of different political forces, and the Chinese began to say that they are going to, on the 24th of February, 1-year anniversary of the conflict in Ukraine, they're going to release a peace plan. Mr. Wang Yi then goes to Moscow. It's likely that they shared the elements of this plan with the Russians, or at least discussed parts of it. And now we have the plan. It's a 12-point plan, pretty straightforward, available at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs website, of the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs. The plan in its 12 points effectively lays out the principles for how the world order should look, respecting sovereignty, abandoning the Cold War mentality, resuming peace talks and ceasing hostilities, and so on. These are basically ideas that emerge right out of the Bandung principles of 1955, tried and true principles, about the so-called Panchshila, 5 principles about sovereignty, about mutual respect, and so on. The interesting phrase here was resuming peace talks. It wants to encourage us to remember that in February, March of last year, the Russians and the Ukrainians met in Belarus on the border with Ukraine and met in Ankara, Turkey, and had a discussion about the kind of ways in which they can de-escalate. That peace process was derailed by the West, which decided that weakening Russia was more important. This was an opportunity, and so on. Well, they are now talking about resuming the peace talks. I was interested in a long section, 2 long sections. One, the section on the humanitarian crisis, the issue of protecting civilians, the importance of maintaining some safe zones around nuclear power plants, and so on. This sort of humanitarian aspect, very important to have in the 12-point agenda. And then, of course, there was the 3 or 4 points which directly reflect on the views of the global South leaders, what they articulated at Munich. For instance, facilitating grain exports. That's the Black Sea Grain Initiative signed by Russia, Turkey, Ukraine, and the UN. That they say should be implemented fully. They say that unilateral sanctions need to stop. This has been a long call by the Chinese. They're keeping open of industrial and supply lines, not permitting supply chains to be disrupted by this conflict. But the most important part was the 12th point, which talks about post-conflict reconstruction and says China will play a role. Very interesting that China has already pledged that it would play a role. Go and have a read of it. It's an interesting text. It's about time we had people talk seriously about peace in Ukraine and ending this conflict. A year on, no sense in fanning the flames. Let's see if we can send the firefighters in. In this case, maybe these 12 points will be a good way to begin. You always give the people what they want. That's what the people want. They want peace. Prashant and Zoe from People's Dispatch, your indispensable source for movement driven news. I'm Vijay from Globetrotter. See you next week.